Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and One Take. One Take, my take on a paper or report on ventilation, air quality and the built environment. One take in that it's done in, well, one take and tries to summarise for you a scientific perspective on something interesting in usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, we're digging into a paper that on the surface might sound a bit nerdy, but who doesn't like a nice nerdy paper, huh? Basically, it answers some of the most fundamental and practical questions we face in building science, questions that are surprisingly difficult to get a straight answer on. The paper is titled Long-Term Indoor Air Quality Monitoring in Office Buildings, Data-Driven and Goal-Orientated Recommendations for Sensor Placement and Sampling Frequency. It's all about monitoring indoor air quality in offices, but not just that we should do it, but the how we should do it. It tackles the really basic questions. Where exactly do we put these sensors? How many do we need? And how often should it actually take a reading? The question matters because if you get them wrong, you're either spending a fortune on equipment you don't need, or you're collecting data that's basically useless, or worse, actively misleading. And as the authors point out, the existing standards are all over the place. One might say you need a sensor every 50 square meters. Another says 325 is fine. One says sample every 15 minutes. Another says 30 is okay. There's a real lack of clear evidence-based guidance here. So what the researchers did was they installed 16 sensors across 3 different office sites in Shanghai and collected a full year's worth of data on PM2.5, PM10, CO2, taking readings every single minute. That is quite a big data set. They also then crunched these numbers to figure out the spatial and temporal patterns. They wanted to know, if you put a sensor over here, does it tell you the same story as a sensor over there? And if you take a reading every hour instead of every minute, what crucial information do you lose? Let's start with particulate matter, PM2.5 and PM10. For particles, the big driver, as you might expect, is outdoors. The indoor PM levels tracked the outdoor levels very closely, showing that infiltration is the dominant factor for the overall trend. This means that for tracking the general day-to-day seasonal trend of particulate matter, you don't need a massive density of sensors. The paper found that the readings from different sensors within the same space were highly correlated. But for CO2, the story is completely different, of course, because CO2 is generated indoors by us, the occupants, and here they found huge differences depending on where the sensor was. The key factors influencing CO2 levels were the type of air conditioning systems, whether there was a central HVAC or a standalone unit, the size of the room, how far the sensor was from the windows or the air outlets, stuff like that. A single sensor in a large complex office space is just not going to cut it. You're going to miss what's really happening in different zones. But here's where the paper gets quite clever, I think. They argue that we're often trying to do 2 different jobs with our monitoring, and we need to separate them. They call it a goal-orientated approach. Job number 1 is what they call the temporal trend monitoring. This is understanding the big picture, the daily cycles, the seasonal changes, the overall average conditions in a space. And job number 2 is high concentration event monitoring. This is about safety and health, effectively. It's not about the average. It's about catching the bad stuff, those short, sharp spikes in pollution when a meeting room fills up or when an outdoor smoke suddenly floods in. And for each of these jobs, the rules for monitoring are completely different. If your goal is just to track the general trend, the paper finds you can get away with a lot less. They recommend about 1 sensor every 150 square meters. And you don't need to sample every minute. For PM, a sampling interval of 90 minutes was enough to capture the overall trend without losing much accuracy. For CO2, you could go even longer, to about 130 minutes. This is a huge finding for anyone managing a large building because it means less data to store, less energy use and less maintenance, all while still getting a good picture of the overall building performance. But if your goal is to catch those high concentration events, manage those spaces, the rules change completely. To reliably catch those short spikes, you need to sample much, much more frequently. For PM2.5 and CO2, they're recommending every 4 minutes or so. For PM10, which they found to be a bit less spiky, every 15 minutes is probably fine. And crucially, you also need more sensors placed strategically in what the paper identifies as high-risk zones. So for CO2, that means adding extra sensors in large rooms or in spaces with standalone AC units, specifically in zones far away from ventilation sources where the pollution is most likely to build up. For PM, it means adding sensors in those same poorly ventilated spots, far from windows or outlets. So the big takeaway here is that there's no single right way to monitor indoor air quality. It all depends on your goal. This paper gives us a data-driven framework, if you like, for making that choice. If you want to understand long-term general trends for, say, building performance analytics, you can use a fairly sparse network of sensors, sampling quite infrequently. But if your primary goal is health and safety to protect occupants from short, sharp peaks of pollution, then you need a denser network of targeted locations, sampling much more often. Of course, this study has its limitations, which the authors acknowledge. This was all done in Shanghai offices, and we'd need to see if these rules of thumb held up in different climates or building types. But it's a fantastic practical starting point. It could be how we move from just putting sensors in buildings because it seems like a good idea to actually implementing smart, cost-effective strategies that give us the data we actually need to make our buildings healthier. It's about being deliberate. It's about monitoring with purpose. Thanks for listening. This has been this week's episode of One Take. These podcasts aren't possible without our partners, Safe Traces in Inbiot, so thanks a million to them. See you again next week.